Okay guys, so back with you. I've got the decoder all soldered up to the truck leads for the front of the locomotive, and then I've got the truck leads from the rear soldered up. I've got the motor leads soldered to the motor tabs, and I briefly tested the locomotive with the decoder just to make sure that it runs properly, both directions, responds to some CV changes, etc., etc., just to test it. So the next thing that I want to do, and this is the first time I'm going to be trying to cram one of these big 28mm high bass speakers in the rear. I've been doing some measurements using my caliper. When you look down inside the shell here, you've got a couple things that you need to be careful of. You've got this screw post right here that holds the shell to the frame. Then you've got this detail part right down in there, and that's part of the exterior of the shell, so that's a bump in. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to mill this plastic out here along both sides, and then you can see this plastic middle part right here. I'm going to try to, well, I'm going to get rid of that. I'm also going to Dremel this down here and Dremel this plastic here. Now, taking my measurements on that 28mm high bass speaker, I know I have the length going across. The question that I'm going to have is my width, and that's going to be a little tight. And what I have to be very mindful of when using my Dremel is not to go too deep and cutting in to the plastic so far that I pop out the top. So it requires a steady hand and taking your time. And I usually set my my Dremel tool on a pretty high speed. One, it produces a more accurate cut and also a smoother cut, and I just take my time. I don't go fast at all when I'm using my Dremel on plastic, because one misstep and through the shell, and that's not what I want to do. So again, I have a mill bit on my Dremel, and I'm going to take all that plastic out there. I'm going to remove as much as I can to see if I can't squeeze that big 28mm speaker up in. Okay, so back with you after Dremeling out that plastic, and again, taking my time, working real slow, evenly, taking a little cuts at a time. It goes well. So I've removed as much plastic as I feel is safe, taken all of my measurements, and I'm going to be able to get that 23mm high bass speaker in there, as I said, no problem. The 28 just isn't going to go. I'm about 2mm shy of depth, and I could probably start cutting down into this plastic holding the fans, but boy, that's some really fine detail work down in there, and one slip of the Dremel tool and I'm going to wreck those fans, and probably go right through the shell, and I just don't want to do that. So I can still get really good sound out of that 23mm bass speaker. Right here, this little, I won't say medium, it's the 23mm, I think it's equates to about 1 inch or whatever. Anyway, still a really capable speaker. And combined with the 1.1 inch round speaker in the front, it's still going to sound great. So, and once I'm done this whole install, I'll do a comparison side by side of a stock SD70ACe with sound that came straight from Athearn, and then I'm gonna compare that with this one, and we'll see where we stand to see if it's worth all this effort. I usually think it is, but you know, we'll do side by side and try to get as scientific as we can, if you know what I mean. Welcome back, YouTubers, and in this installment I'm going to be connecting my speakers with these little small micro connectors, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these connectors in parallel with the speakers, and so that way when I remove the shell, all I've got to do is just take apart that connector, and it comes apart in two pieces like that, and it just the metal contacts just slide into each other. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the all the lighting. And for the lighting, I'm going to be using this 4 connector, and it's exactly the same material, and in fact you can get these connectors in strips of, I think they come in like strips up to like 50, and you can just cut it with a small miter, hobby miter saw. And what I'm going to do is, on this particular connector, again I'm going to have this wired in line for the headlights and ditch lights. And so what I'll do is I'll wire the hots for all of the connectors here on this side, on the 3. So I'll have the rear headlight coming to this prong, I'll have the front headlight coming to this one, and the ditch, and on the opposite side the same output. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie all the common to this one over here, and then I'll have the common coming from my board to this side. So that way, if in the future, if I ever need to disassemble the locomotive, it's really simple. Okay, so I've got my speakers wired up in parallel, and then between the front speaker, which is going to go in the enclosure towards the front of the locomotive, and the rear speaker, and that's going to be mounted up inside the radiator, I've got this connector. And so I've wired my red or plus side of the high bass speaker to the same side of the connector, going to the red of my front speaker. And then you can see the plus or red wire here, and that's going to go to the positive side of my output speaker on the Tsunami. And then the same thing is just the opposite for the negative. I've got my my other wire, my black wire, going from my high bass back to the connector, same side as the negative side of the speaker to the front, and then that negative side of the speaker then goes back to the negative tab on the decoder. Whenever you're wiring speakers in parallel, it's important that you maintain the same polarity. So if you're running parallel speakers, 2 parallel speakers off of the decoder, plus goes to plus, minus goes to minus, and normally most speakers have like a little red or positive mark on them. Either that, if they don't have any kind of marking, usually you can find something on the speaker itself that indicates a a similar or same side, so that way you can run parallel speakers. Okay, so I've got the front speaker glued into the front enclosure, and you can see here I've got my positive side of the speaker wire coming back, indicated by the red, and then my negative on this pad right here. And if you kind of look in there, you see that solder still has a nice shiny sheen to it. That means I've got a good joint there. And then you can see back here on my negative side of the motor and my plus side of the motor. And what I do is, for all of my wires that are coming onto this board along the sides, I simply come up through like these little side notches, and I curl my wire from the middle pointing back out to the pad, because the fit on this locomotive is so tight that I don't want wires coming up on the side and getting caught in there. So my mantra is neatness counts, and that way you do it once, you do it neat, and you don't have to go back and monkey with it. And then also you don't have to struggle with taking the shell on and off because you've got some wires. And it just takes a few extra seconds just to bundle it up nice and neat like that. And if you take your time, you know, you shouldn't have any issues with getting the correct measurement for all of your wire leads. Right about there, you can see where I've got it glued in here, and I use a contact cement. It's called Plyobond, and this stuff is just wonderful. I use it on a ton of stuff. If I'm not using CA super type glues, I'm using that Plyobond, which is a contact cement, and it's really good for adhering unlike surfaces or materials to each other. And especially doing decoder installs where you may not want an absolutely permanent adhesive. You just slip a hobby knife or, you know, a small little screwdriver, whatever, some kind of blade, and you can usually quite easily remove things from the adhesive. The other thing too, before I forget, is on those connectors, for example on the speaker connector, you can see here that my speaker wires going to the one side of the connector are bare. You can see where that connector shows from the wire where it's soldered. And what I'm going to do is, in order to insulate that, I'm going to dab some super glue on there, or CA, any type of CA glue. It's an excellent insulator, and for small applications like this where you don't want to put some shrink tube on, you're just protecting bare metal from making a short within the locomotive, CA glue works wonders. So I'm going to dab a little bit of that on there now before I forget, and then we'll start proceeding on the LED installation.